The night Loretta Haines walked out of Dante Severino's Westmount estate, the temperature in Montreal had dropped to -23. She didn't feel it. 3 years of living as a ghost had frozen her from the inside out, long before the January wind ever touched her skin. By morning, she would be gone. By the week's end, the most feared man in the province of Quebec would be pulling the city apart brick by brick, searching for a woman he had told. In front of his entire inner circle, meant absolutely nothing to him. He was going to be wrong about that too, just like he'd been wrong about everything else. Loretta had grown up in Laval, in a narrow duplex that always smelled of cigarettes and reheated pea soup. Her father, Dante Haines, was a man of spectacular, ruinous optimism. He believed the next hockey bet would fix the last one. He believed the men he owed money to were reasonable. He believed, until the night two of Dante Severino's people sat at his kitchen table and laid out the terms, that his daughter would never be made to pay for his mistakes. He was wrong about all of it. Loretta was 23 when she signed the marriage certificate in a notary's office on St. Catherine Street. She was wearing a dress borrowed from her downstairs neighbor. Her father didn't come to the signing. He couldn't look at her. Dante Severino was 39 and controlled more of Montreal's East End real estate and port operations than any single politician or police superintendent cared to examine too closely. He was a tall man, dark-haired, with the kind of jaw that looked like it had been carved for intimidation. He arrived to the notary's office 11 minutes late, signed where the notary pointed, and did not once look at Loretta's face. She weighed 263 pounds on the morning of that signing. She knew this because she'd stepped on the scale in the borrowed dress before leaving. The way a woman does when she's spent her whole life being told her body is a problem that needs solving. In Dante's world, she was simply another kind of problem, a debt made flesh, a signature that kept the peace between a small-time bookie in Laval and the most dangerous man in the province. They moved into the Westmount estate that spring. It was a stone house behind iron gates, with a kitchen larger than her entire childhood home. There was a housekeeper, a groundskeeper, and a rotating cast of men in expensive suits who came and went at all hours. Loretta had her own room, her own bathroom, her own wing, really, because Dante's people made clear from the beginning that she was not to appear at meetings, was not to answer the phone, and was not to exist in any way that inconvenienced the operation. So she didn't. She read. She cooked things nobody asked her to cook. She learned the layout of every room in that house, the way she'd learned the layout of every hotel floor she'd ever cleaned, systematically, quietly, in a way that left no trace. Before the marriage, she'd worked 3 years as a housekeeper at a downtown hotel. She knew how to be invisible in a space that didn't belong to her. What nobody noticed, not Dante, not his enforcer Pietro, not the rotating staff, was that invisible people see everything. The breaking point arrived on a Thursday in November at a fundraising gala for a children's hospital in the Old Port. These events were important to Dante. They were the face he wore over the other face, the generous patron, the successful businessman, the man who bought tables at charity dinners and smiled for photographs with city councillors. Loretta wore a burgundy gown she'd had made by a seamstress in the Plateau. It draped over her shoulders and gathered at her waist in a way that felt, for one quiet moment in front of the bathroom mirror, genuinely beautiful. That feeling lasted until she reached the gala's main hall. Dante was standing near the bar with his inner circle. Pietro on his left, 3 other men whose names she'd learned from listening through walls, and a woman named Claudine, narrow and luminous in a white dress that probably cost more than Loretta's monthly household allowance. Claudine had been at the last 3 events. She laughed at everything Dante said and touched his arm when she did it. Loretta approached because she was expected to. Because that was the performance, the stable marriage, the respectable front. She made it 4 steps before Claudine turned to look at her. The assessment was slow and deliberate, the kind that moves from shoes upward and arrives at the face with a particular expression. Not quite a sneer, just a calm and practiced dismissal. "Dante," Claudine said, not lowering her voice at all, "does she need to stand here? I feel like the catering staff are trying to get through." One of the men laughed, small sound, but it carried. Loretta looked at her husband. She waited. By every rule of the world Dante operated in, her humiliation was his humiliation. You did not disrespect a man's wife without consequence. She had actually heard him say exactly that about another man's wife at a dinner 2 years prior. Dante looked at her. His expression did not change. "Go back to the table, Loretta," he said. "You're in the way." "I haven't moved," she said quietly. "Your being here is enough." He turned back to Claudine. "You were saying?" She found him later in his study, after the guests had gone and the estate had settled back into its usual cold silence. He was at his desk, jacket off, displaying the particular tiredness that high-functioning dangerous men only allow when they think no one is watching. She was always watching. "Why did you agree to this?" she asked from the doorway. "The marriage. If I simply embarrass you by existing, why bother with any of it?" He looked up slowly. It was an arrangement, a practical solution to a specific problem. "I know what it was. I'm asking why you've never—" She stopped, reorganized her words. "I am a person, Dante. I live in this house. I carry your name." He set down his pen. He stood, and he crossed the room to her slowly. Not in a way that felt like intimacy, but the way a man moves when he wants to make his size and his stillness very clear. He stopped close enough that she could smell the scotch he'd been drinking since they got home. "Let me be precise," he said, his voice dropping into that register she'd heard him use when he was about to end a conversation permanently. "You are a liability your father created. You are a signature on a document that prevents a very old and very tedious conflict from restarting. You are not a partner. You are not a wife in any sense that matters. You are an obligation I inherited with your father's debt, and you mean nothing, nothing to me beyond that. Do you understand?" He walked back to his desk. He picked up his pen. He did not look at her again. Loretta stood in the hallway for a long time after that. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in this house since the first month, and she'd stopped because crying achieved nothing and left her with a headache that made the long days harder to get through. What arrived instead was something colder and cleaner. A thought, very quiet, like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known was there. He was right that she meant nothing. He was wrong about what that meant for him. Because while Loretta had been invisible and unimportant and entirely beneath notice, she had also, out of sheer habit, because she'd spent 3 years as a housekeeper, and organization was the only way she knew how to make an unlivable space livable, quietly and methodically put his entire operation in order. She had reorganized his filing system 18 months ago because the chaos of it genuinely bothered her. She had cross-referenced his shell companies because she was bored and because the accounting errors were making her anxious. She had memorized the combination to his private safe because she'd watched him open it enough times that her brain simply retained it, the way it retained hotel room numbers and supply delivery schedules. She knew every account, every false business name, every city official who'd been paid, every pressure point in the structure he'd built over 2 decades. He had dismissed her so completely that it had never once occurred to him that she might be paying attention. She decided that night to give him exactly what he'd asked for. Nothing. To remove herself from his world entirely and leave him to discover what had been holding the whole thing together. Leaving Dante Severino wasn't a matter of packing a bag and buying a bus ticket. It was, as Loretta understood it, a matter of not dying. If she simply disappeared, he would search. Not from any feeling, but because a missing wife invited questions, and questions were dangerous for business. If she ran without preparation, she'd be found within a week by men far better at finding people than she was at hiding. She needed to cease to exist. She spent 5 weeks planning. Her invisibility, the thing that had been her prison, became her most precise tool. The staff barely registered her comings and goings. She began taking afternoon walks to the pharmacy, the library, the dépanneur on the corner, and nobody questioned it, because nobody had ever tracked where she went or why. She was furniture. Furniture wasn't monitored. On the 4th walk, she made contact through a woman she'd known at the hotel. A former colleague whose cousin did document work for people who needed to stop being who they were. The meeting happened in the back of a laundromat on Beaubien Street, 2 machines running, the noise making any recording useless. She liquidated her mother's TFSA, the small account that had come to her 3 years ago and that she'd never touched because it felt like the last clean thing she owned. She became on paper Marie Toussaint, born in Rimouski, quiet life, moved around. The right night arrived in late January. A rival group had moved against Dante's port operations. Something to do with a container shipment and a territorial disagreement that had been simmering since autumn. Dante and Pietro and every capable man in the organization were mobilizing. The Est was all hard voices and vehicles idling in the cold. Dante passed her in the hallway without speaking. He was already somewhere else in his mind. "Lock the doors," he told the men staying behind, "no one in or out." The door closed. The engine sounds faded down the drive. Loretta counted to 60. Then she moved. She went to the study. She opened the safe. 6 digits. Right, left, right. She'd watched him do it 40 times. And took the master ledger, the physical one, the one that predated the digital records and served as the key to decoding everything else. She did not take a single piece of jewelry, not a change of clothes. She was wearing dark trousers, a heavy wool sweater, her warmest coat, her most sensible boots. She left one item on his desk, her wedding ring, platinum, set precisely in the center of his leather blotter, like a period at the end of a sentence. The service entrance at the rear of the property was unmonitored that night. All eyes were on the perimeter, watching for threats from outside. Nobody was watching for something leaving from within. She walked through the kitchen, through the mudroom, out into the alley behind the house. A cab she'd arranged 3 days earlier was waiting 2 streets over. By the time the sun came up, Marie Toussaint was on a bus heading east. She ended up in a place called Port Medway, Nova Scotia. It was small enough that her arrival was noticed and quickly absorbed into the general fact of winter, which, in a fishing village on the South Shore, has a way of making newcomers either leave or quietly become permanent. She stayed. She rented a room above a tackle and bait shop from an older woman named Agatha, who had a long grey braid and absolutely no patience for nonsense, and who, within 3 days of Loretta's arrival, had assessed her completely and decided she was worth keeping. "You can cook?" Agatha asked, standing in the small kitchen doorway. "I can cook," Loretta said. "The diner on the water's looking for someone Tuesday through Saturday, 6 to 2. It's not glamorous work." "I didn't come here for glamour." Agatha had looked at her for a long moment. "No," she said finally, "I don't imagine you did." Loretta started at the diner that week. She made chowder and biscuits and the particular kind of scrambled eggs that take patience and low heat, and the fishermen and the retirees and the occasional early tourist came in and ate, and she fed them, and nobody once looked at her body and turned it into a remark. It was so ordinary, it was enormous. There was a man who came in every morning for black coffee and a date square. Owen Balfe, a boat builder whose hands were permanently weather-chapped, and who read the same battered paperback novel at the counter for 3 weeks before she finally asked him what it was. He had the kind of easy stillness that Loretta associated with people who had no interest in impressing anyone. He noticed when she started wearing her hair differently. He shoveled the walk in front of the diner one morning before she arrived, without being asked. Once, when she came in from the supply delivery with her arms full and the door swinging hard in the wind behind her, he'd crossed the room in 2 strides to take the boxes, and then simply said, "Cold out," like it was the most natural thing in the world, like her comfort was a thing worth considering. She kept waiting for the other shoe. There was no other shoe. Back in Montreal, the shoe dropped differently. Pietro found the ring. He reportedly stood in the study for nearly 10 minutes before going to find Dante. What followed moved through the underworld like a weather event. Dante didn't take it quietly. He dismantled his own study. Bookshelves, the desk, a filing cabinet that had to be levered away from the wall afterward. He threw a crystal decanter through the window overlooking the garden. Then he turned on Pietro and demanded to know, in specific and escalating terms, how a woman had walked out of a monitored estate during a crisis mobilization without a single person noticing. Pietro had no good answer. The assumption for the first 3 days was that she'd been taken. A kidnapping, a pressure move from the port dispute. Dante responded accordingly, hitting safe houses, pulling men in from the cold, demanding information with methods that kept a certain South End clinic unusually occupied for a Tuesday. Nobody had her, nobody knew anything, because nobody had taken her. When that truth began to settle, when the evidence pointed not to an outside threat but to a woman who had walked out of her own life carrying nothing but her coat and her composure, Dante went very still, which was, according to everyone who reported it later, considerably more frightening than the shouting had been. The word that came back, through the contact Loretta still trusted, was that he had fired Claudine the 2nd day. Nearly threw her down the front steps when she came to the estate, that he had stopped sleeping in his own room, that he'd been seen sitting for long stretches in Loretta's empty bedroom, among the dresses she had left behind, staring at the untouched side of the bed. His empire was beginning to show the cracks she had quietly been papering over for 3 years. Accounts that had been running cleanly were now flagging inconsistencies. Contacts who had been managed with precision, and patients were receiving late responses, if any. The organization hadn't collapsed. It was too large for that, but it was fraying, in the way that complex systems fray when the single person who understood them fully is no longer there. He hired a private investigator, former federal intelligence, a man named Moreau, who had a reputation for locating people who very much did not want to be found. Loretta had been careful, cash only, no phone she'd carried before, no driving, no digital trail of any ordinary kind. Her one imprecision was human. In late February, she used a prepaid phone to call from a payphone in Liverpool, 18 kilometers from Port Medway, to check briefly on a friend she'd left behind in Montreal who'd been sick. 2 minutes. She hung up. Moreau traced the call to a radius of 40 kilometers in Lunenburg County, Nova Scotia. He narrowed it from there. It took him 11 days. The storm came in on a Wednesday. The south shore of Nova Scotia in early March produces the kind of weather that closes roads and turns the world outside into a grey-white wall of nothing. This was that kind of storm. Agatha had sent the part-timer home at noon. Loretta was alone in the diner, wiping down the pie case, the radio low in the background, the smell of coffee still in the air from the afternoon rush. There was something very particular about that kind of peace. She'd started to recognize it, not as the absence of trouble, but as an actual presence, something she could feel. The bell above the door rang. "We're closed," she said, not looking up. "Storm coming in." The cold that entered with the door was not the ordinary cold of a Nova Scotia winter. It was the cold of a different world, expensive cologne and tension, and something she recognized in her blood before her brain caught up. She looked up. Dante Severino stood in the doorway of a diner in Port Medway, Nova Scotia, with 3 inches of snow on the shoulders of his black overcoat and an expression she had never seen on his face in 3 years of living in the same house as him. He looked terrible. The overcoat was expensive, but hung wrong on him, like he'd lost weight he hadn't had to spare. His face was shadowed and hollowed. His eyes were the most changed thing. She'd always known his eyes to be flat, controlled, giving nothing away. Right now they were not flat at all. They were searching and raw in a way that aged him, and frightened her for reasons she couldn't immediately name. Through the diner's front windows, past the blowing snow, she could make out the dim shapes of 2 black vehicles idling on the road outside. Loretta, he said, just her name and the way it came out, as though something had torn open in his chest to let it through. Her heart was loud. She made herself breathe. She set down the cloth in her hand and came around to the other side of the counter. She needed something solid between them. "My name is Marie," she said. Her voice did not shake. "And you need to leave." He stepped inside. He let the door fall shut. He stood in the middle of her diner, her flour-dusted, warm, honest diner, and looked at her the way a man looks at something he has just understood too late to do anything useful about. His gaze moved over her, the messy bun, the apron, the thick-knit cardigan, the fullness of her arms and waist and hips. He looked at her as though he was memorizing her. 41 days, he said. I turned the cities inside out. I put men in 7 provinces. I questioned people who had absolutely no reason to know anything. That sounds like it was very hard for you, Loretta said. His jaw tightened. You took the ledger. I took my ability to survive. The ledger was practical. She held his gaze. You should go, Dante. There's nothing here for you. He moved closer. He had always been physically imposing, and the years had not changed that. He stopped at the counter, his hands resting on the edge of it. Come back, he said. The words were quiet, and underneath them was something exposed that she hadn't expected. I'll change the arrangement. Whatever you want. Your own accounts, the house in your name, staff who answer to you, whatever it takes. You want me to say I'm sorry? He continued, his voice going rougher. I'm saying it. Right now. I'm sorry. Come home. The bell above the door rang again. Owen stood in the doorway, snow on his jacket, his eyes moving from Loretta to the man at the counter and then back to her. She saw him read the room, the tension, the vehicles outside, the way she was holding herself. Everything all right? Owen asked. Dante turned. The shift in him was instantaneous. Whatever had been exposed a moment ago vanished, replaced by the cold assessment of a threat. She saw his hand begin to move toward his coat. Owen, stay right there, Loretta said sharply. She stepped around the counter and put herself directly between the two of them, pressing one hand against Dante's chest. He stopped. He looked down at her hand with an expression she couldn't fully read. You will not, she said quietly, looking up at him. Not him. Not this town. Not one person here. Do you understand me? You don't get to bring that into this. Clara, Owen said. He'd called her that since the 2nd week, and she'd let it stand. I'm fine, she said, not taking her eyes off Dante. Give me a minute. She turned back to face her husband fully. He was still close, and she made herself stay where she was. She thought about the gala, about the study, about the words he'd chosen with such deliberate, careful precision. An obligation you inherited with my father's debt, she said quietly. Nothing beyond that. You were very clear. Something moved across his face. I remember everything you said to me in that house, Loretta continued. I had a great deal of time to sit with it. She reached into the pocket of her apron. She had moved the drive 3 times in the past weeks, always keeping it on her, because she had always known that this moment was a possibility. She set the small, encrypted drive on the counter between them. Dante's eyes went to it immediately. "The ledger is backed up," she said. "I encoded it the first week before I left Montreal. It sits on a server that I access every Sunday afternoon. If I miss a check-in, for any reason, under any circumstances, the file pushes automatically." She paused. "To the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit in Ottawa. To 2 journalists at La Presse who have been looking for a story like this for 3 years. And to the people in Marseille that you've been skimming from on the southern contracts." The silence in the diner was total, except for the wind pressing against the windows. "You're bluffing," Dante said. "Try me," she said. "Send Moreau back. Send anyone. See what happens next Sunday." He was calculating. She could see it, the same stillness he got when he was assessing a situation, running every variable, and arriving at the same conclusion she had already arrived at, weeks before he ever walked through the door. "What do you want?" he asked. His voice had changed again, quiet in a different way, the way a man sounds when he is genuinely asking. "I want to stay here," Loretta said. "I want to make soup and open the diner at 6 and walk to the harbor on my days off and not be afraid of anything." She held his gaze. "I want you to go back to Montreal and fix whatever's broken and leave me entirely, permanently alone." He looked at the drive on the counter. "My operation." "I know exactly what your operation is," she said. "I kept your books for 3 years because no one else was doing it correctly and the errors were making me anxious. The decryption key is on that drive. Use it." She slid it across the counter toward him. "The dead man's switch stays active. If Moreau or anyone else comes near Port Medway, I don't check in on Sunday. If anything happens to Owen or to Agatha or to my father in Laval, I don't check in on Sunday. If you send so much as a letter, I don't check in on Sunday." She looked at him steadily. "You built something over 20 years, Dante. I know every corner of it. Walk away from this, save what's left." He stood there, the drive in front of him, the weight of everything he'd done and left undone pressing down on him visibly. Then, slowly, without any of the controlled ease she'd watched him carry through rooms for 3 years, Dante Severino lowered himself to his knees on the old wood floor of the diner. The sound his knees made hitting the floor was quiet and final. She had thought about this in the dark hours, what she might feel if she ever saw him like this. She had half expected something sharp, some version of satisfaction that she thought she was probably entitled to. What arrived instead was something much quieter. The particular tiredness of a person who has carried something very heavy for a very long time and has just finally set it down. "I was wrong about all of it," Dante said. His voice was rough. "You were the only person in that house who was ever straight with me. The only one keeping things from going sideways. I told myself you were nothing because if I had admitted what you actually were, I would have had to admit that it mattered. And in my world," he stopped, pressed his mouth together. When he looked up at her, his eyes were different from every other time she had seen them. "I'm sorry. I am genuinely, completely sorry." Loretta looked at him on the floor of her diner. She thought about the girl who had signed a marriage certificate in a borrowed dress. She thought about 3 years of eating breakfast alone and knowing every safe combination and watching a man she'd quietly, foolishly hoped might see her someday treat her instead like she was part of the wall. She thought about chowder, about date squares, about the way the harbor looked at dawn when the fog was still sitting on it. "I believe you," she said, and she meant it, which was the strangest thing of all. She stepped back. She picked up her cloth from the counter. "There's a road south that'll stay clear for another hour before the storm comes in fully. You should start driving." He remained on the floor for a moment longer. Then he got up, slowly, without the ease she'd always associated with him, and took the drive from the counter. He held it carefully, like a man who understood precisely what he was holding and what it meant that she was giving it back to him. He said nothing else. He walked to the door and opened it, and the wind came in, bringing the cold and the smell of the ocean with it. He stepped out into the white, and the door swung shut behind him, and through the fogged window, she watched the tail lights of the black vehicles dissolve into the storm until there was nothing left but the road and the snow. Owen was still standing near the entrance. He hadn't moved through any of it. "You want to tell me who that was?" he asked after a moment. "Someone who decided I was nothing," Loretta said, "and then spent 41 days proving himself wrong." Owen pulled out a stool at the counter and sat down. He didn't ask anything else. That was one of the things about him. He understood when a question had already been answered. "Any coffee left?" he asked. "There's always coffee," she said. She poured it. She set the mug down in front of him. Outside, the storm was coming in hard now, the kind of full wall of white that would close off the roads and keep the whole village tucked in warm until morning. Loretta Haines was 26 years old and 260-something pounds, and she could cook, and she kept precise books, and she knew how to be invisible in any room she walked into. She also knew, had always known, had simply needed the right conditions to act on it, that invisible people see everything, and that the most dangerous woman in any room is almost always the one nobody thought to watch. She turned the sign in the window to closed, topped up Owen's coffee, and listened to the storm settle over Port Medway like a held breath finally released. She did not feel afraid. She did not feel small. She felt, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, entirely like herself.